Hi there, my name is Clark Heron, aka the Hairy Hobo, and welcome to another edition of Debatable. Hello again, my name is Clark Heron, aka the Hairy Hobo, and I am your host for Debatable. It's where I talk about some of the hardest hitting debates that we talk about in the sports world and try to end them myself. Yes, and this week we'll be talking about something that's a little bit more opinionated compared to last week, as well as more nostalgia. Now, we're going to try to get rid of the nostalgia factor, but it's going to be rather difficult. For example, this week's topic is one that started back in 2004. Technically, over the past 7 years, it's gained some really big type of ground, gaining more stats to try and help or even hurt the case of either side of the argument. Now for this week, I'm going to be talking about who is the greatest of all time in basketball. Michael Jordan versus LeBron James. Now this is the type of debate that has been long-standing, again, over the past 7 years or so, simply because LeBron James continues to add to his stats, either getting a little bit closer with a couple, 3 championships to his credit, or a little bit further away by losing 5 NBA Finals. But we're not here to pick on LeBron. We're here to actually look at the stats, figure out exactly who's better than who, and try and figure out exactly who the greatest of all time is. Now this debate has been ongoing for a while, and some of the greatest experts in the world have been talking about it, and it's literally been about 50-50 for the most part. There's the Jordan camp versus LeBron. Now, in order to get rid of the nostalgia factor, which can impede progress, we're going to have to eliminate the people who only view Jordan or LeBron as their heroes. Now, the reason I say that is simple. If you're a LeBron fan and you say it's your hero, the one that you've idolized since growing up, it's not going to be the same for Jordan fans. They're going to think Jordan's that way because they grew up watching him, wanting to be like Mike campaign, of course. And the same for LeBron camp as well. If you're the type of person that wants to debate that and use that as your main stat, unfortunately we're not going to use that in here. But for me, I'm going to be looking at some stats as well as some hardcore information that can help us actually make a separation between the two players. So, how are we going to tackle this? Well, I think what we have to do is look at some key stats early on that's going to help determine who's the greatest of all time. Now, one of those stats, obviously, and I think a lot of people would agree with me, is we're going to first look at NBA championships won. Now, obviously, there's a disparity there. LeBron has won 3 NBA championships, 2 with Miami, 1 with Cleveland, and Michael Jordan has won 6. So, obviously, we'll give the check mark to Jordan. However, let's look at those a little bit closer. Really, anybody from any team, even if they don't play in the finals, gets a ring. They win that championship. So, how can we define this further to try and make it sound a little bit better to find the greatest player? The best one, in my example, would be finals MVPs. Pretty simple. LeBron has won 3 in the 3 that he won, and then also Jordan has won 6 finals MVPs. So we're going to give this one to Jordan. Now, it wouldn't surprise me if eventually LeBron caught up in this stat, but for now, Jordan gets the check mark. The next stat we're going to look at is one that is going to be talked about just here recently. It's going to be points scored in the NBA playoffs. LeBron James actually just passed Michael Jordan this past postseason with the most points all time in the playoffs. Let's give this check to LeBron. Now, if we look at the season totals for career points, Michael Jordan ranks 4th all time, and I believe LeBron ranks 7th or 8th, somewhere in that region. He's about a little shy of 4,000 points behind Michael, and again, with LeBron's career not quite over yet, there's a real chance that he'll catch that. So for now, we'll give the checkpoint to Michael, but it wouldn't surprise me if LeBron takes it eventually. So now we're at a crossroad. I've literally named a few stats, not really anything tremendously big. Now granted, Jordan's camp would be all over the fact that he won 6 NBA Finals and Finals MVPs, whereas LeBron is 3-5 in Finals, but he did win the 3 Finals MVPs in which he actually won. So what other stats can we look at? What other stats can we actually take a look at and see if there's a potential gap? And that's why this debate is so hard to deal with, because over the past 7 years to be exact, LeBron has been to the finals every single year, keeps adding to his stats, and makes it either more difficult in some situations or a little bit easier in some situations to try and find the answer. But literally over the past 7 years, analysts from either side have been trying to find any source of information, any statistic that can easily determine an answer. Well, I'm here to say this, and I stand by it, and I'll give you 2 big reasons why I believe all these stats that we've talked about for the past 7 years, any stat you want to bring up even now, is completely useless. Let me say that again. Every stat that you can think of to try and compare these 2 great players is completely useless. Now, before you turn off the video, hear me out. There's 2 big reasons why we can't use any of this information. Number 1, they played in different eras of basketball. Granted, Jordan retired in 2003 and LeBron played in 2004, so there's a small gap. They never crisscrossed. They never played against one another. They never played in the same era. There was no crossing. Jordan played most of his career during the physical 90s, where everybody was allowed to do a little bit more physically in the NBA game. Whereas nowadays, it's much more of a hack-a-shack league, as well as more of a show rather than a game. Nothing wrong with that, but it's just different. You had team game in the 90s versus more one-on-one, maybe 2-on-2, less of a team game now, up until recently where super teams are being formed. So really there's no crossing. They didn't play one another. They didn't play against one another. So that's literally my second point. There's really hardly anybody that we can look at that they've played against a certain person. Now some would say, well, there was Kobe, that both played against Kobe, or Shaq, or even Tim Duncan. They all crossed that bridge. It's true, but it's very few points and very small to look at when you're actually trying to determine a big gap. It's just like looking at stats when LeBron continues to add to them and adds a little bit more and says, well, before he was down so-so, but now he's this much closer. Now is he considered the greatest? It's hard to do. And again, there's no common points. They don't cross at all. So none of those stats, none of that information can actually work to help determine this debate. So now you're looking at me and saying, whoa, Clark, you talked about a few stats. You told us 2 reasons why they're completely useless. All we have is stats. They didn't cross at all. They didn't play the same people or the same teams. How are we going to get an answer? What's the purpose of this video? Well, I think I have a solution for you. First, let's talk about a big question that I've had on my mind about this debate. And it's pretty simple. Do we even have the top 2 players of all time for this debate? What if Jordan's number 2 and LeBron's number 3? What if LeBron is number 2 and Jordan's number 3? Who's number 1? How can we determine that? Do we even have the 2 right players for this debate? Well, the reason I asked that question is because there's many other players that played well before Jordan's or LeBron's era that really need to be mentioned and considered for the greatest of all time. Players like Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, Wilt Chamberlain, Oscar Robinson, Bill Russell, and several others. So now that I've named these off, and you're going to bring up the same information I just gave you, how can we compare different era players versus one another? Well, it would be really, really nice if they all played in the same era, a la Magic versus Bird, where they came in college, played in the national championship against one another, and then played most of their careers, obviously Bird's a little bit longer than Johnson's, but played a majority of their prime years against one another, and their teams played against one another in the finals. So if you really wanted to argue Bird versus Johnson, you could, simply because there's so many stats and so much information that you could actually use to get an actual answer. So, what about these other players? What can we learn from them? What can we use from them? Are they even considered? Well, here's a person that I didn't even list yet, and maybe you probably never heard of before. Now, you've recognized his last name if you've ever watched or ever played basketball and did basketball drills growing up. His name is George Mikan. And if you ever done the Mikan drill, where you do a layup on one side, catch the ball midair, and then do a layup on the other side, go back and forth, that's the Mikan drill. Better known from George Mikan himself. Now, why do I bring up a guy that played in the very early days of basketball, played college back in DePaul University back in the mid-40s, and then played in the early stages of basketball in the NBA? How? I mean, why are we even talking about George Mikan? Well, two reasons. Number one was the first rule that was created for him, or technically against him. Back when he was playing in DePaul, he was so tall. He was 6'10", and for that size and for that era, that's ginormous. It's like having Yao Ming now, but Yao Ming with the body type of LeBron James. Now, George wasn't that quite athletic, but for the time, he really was. He was so dominant, he was so good at jumping up and grabbing the ball as it was on its downward trajectory to keep the ball from going in. And that really led to some very low scoring in the early days of basketball. And you're saying, whoa, how is that legal? Well, in the early days of basketball, goaltending wasn't a rule. It was not a thing. You could literally put your hand through the net and block a shot if you really wanted to. And that's exactly what George did. Well, he did it so well that the NCAA actually instituted a rule for goaltending. And so did the NBA. Him and Bob Curlin, the other major player in that, were two of the biggest names that actually made the rule to keep their dominance from being so dominant. Then later on, they actually instilled the rule to widen the paint, or the free throw lane, because of George Mikan's ability inside to cover the entire area with little to no effort. Imagine, this player was so good during his time playing both in college and the NBA that they literally had to make two rules to make him less dominant. Now, there's only one other big name player that I can think of that had rules created for him, but his name's not Jordan, his name's not LeBron or Kobe or Magic or Bird or anybody like that, but it was for Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. When he was playing at UCLA, he had a rule instituted in 1951 that lasted 16 years, where the NCAA thought it was too easy for him to dunk the basketball. He put little or no effort into it. So they said, you cannot dunk any further. Now, hindsight being 2020, it actually was a blessing in disguise, because yes, he couldn't dunk anymore, but he learned how to do that epic skyhook, which led him to the top of the NBA scoring list. And then also in the NBA, they had to further widen the paint because of how dominant Kareem Abdul-Jabbar was. So I bring up these other players, and we've been trying to figure out who's the greatest of all time, Jordan or LeBron. That's really where the debate stands. But why these two names? Why aren't other players considered for this honor? Well, I think I have an answer for that. Most of the people discussing this between Jordan and LeBron are either from the LeBron or the Jordan camps. They grew up watching these players. They idolize these players. They're heroes in their minds. I mean, Be Like Mike was huge in the 90s. And now you have LeBron, and so many kids want to be like LeBron. They want to be the king. So obviously, nostalgia and potentially team bias is a big part of this debate. Unfortunately, it is, and it shouldn't be. But that's really all we have to go on. Again, none of the stats are useful simply because they never played in the same era, nor did they really play the same players for the majority. And, I mean, all you have to do is look back and say, I grew up watching him. That's why I love him so much. And you would hate the thought, if you were Jordan camp, to look at LeBron and say, man, He passed my idol. He's better than my idol. I don't want to come to grips with that. I can't really say that for certain, but let's look at it this way. Let's look at it per era. Maybe that's what we need to look at. So, for the early stages of the NBA, George Mikan would be considered as one of the greats for that era in which he played. Later on would have been the likes of Bill Russell or Wilt Chamberlain or Kareem Abdul-Jabbar in the 70s, and then the 80s comes along, or Magic or Bird, and we can actually talk about that. In the 90s, I mean, who else are you going to look at besides Jordan? And then in the 2000s, it's a heavy dose of LeBron, with some people probably voting for Kobe or even Shaq or maybe even Tim Duncan. But it's a tough one. By era, it's a little bit easier because you can actually compare player versus player, team versus team, and have an idea between maybe a 10-year time frame who was the best. Unfortunately, this is a debate I literally don't have an answer for. I can give you a solution about who's the best based on each era, but there really isn't an answer to determine who's the best of all time, Jordan or LeBron. But I don't think that's exactly what we're trying to find the answer for. I think what the question really is who's better, Jordan or LeBron. Now that we can actually talk about a little bit. Granted, there's no stats that I can use, but when it comes to pure athleticism and passing the eye test, that's pretty simple. Now, when you look at Michael Jordan and you watched him play, it was poetry in motion. But remember, he was a much better shooting guard and a small forward than anything else. He was very, very athletic, absolutely. But ideally, you didn't want him playing the point guard position just because there were better options and he was better suited for the 2 or 3 spot. And he wasn't quite big enough to play the 4 or 5 ideally. Obviously, during that time, when the likes of David Robinson and Hakeem Olajuwon is the name I'm looking for, were patrolling the paint, you didn't want Jordan messing around in there. But it's a little different for LeBron. In this day and age, they're absolutely looking for the next LeBron, to be honest with you. They're looking for that player that can play literally every single position. Again, ideally you don't want him at the point because you can run him much better as a 2, 3, or 4, but he's also big enough to handle most bigs on the inside, especially during his era of basketball where the bigs really aren't that big anymore. I mean, they're still big people, but they're much more athletic. Look at DeMarcus Cousins, Anthony Davis. I mean, these are the type of players that literally Anthony Davis can play every single position, and he's huge. It's phenomenal. So athletically speaking, if you're looking at how many positions each person can play, LeBron has a huge upside compared to Jordan. Now, eventually, we'll see at the end of LeBron's career if he can actually surpass him in the points department. And if that be the case, obviously my point of view would be more of LeBron is much more athletically given and a better player than Jordan. But obviously the biggest thing with Jordan camp is simply the fact that he won 6 NBA championships, he won them all, and he was finals MVP of every single one of them. That's a pretty impressive stat. So in conclusion, really these two players can't be compared or talked about for the greatest of all time. It just can't happen. Number one, they can't be compared against one another because they didn't play one another, nor do any of their stats crisscross at all. And we don't even know if they're 1 and 2. It's just popular opinion about if they're 1 and 2. If we went back and actually grew up watching Bill Russell or Kareem or Wilt or even George Mikan, we may have a huge, vastly different view about who we consider for the greatest of all time. The better question is, who's the better player? And for that, unfortunately, that's where nostalgia comes into play. I want to thank absolutely every single one of you for watching this video. Please leave a comment in the comment section. Maybe I'm missing something. Maybe I overlooked a point that we can actually use for this debate to try and find an answer. If so, I would love to hear from you. Also, like and subscribe my Yahoo page. Yahoo is the wrong one. Also, like and subscribe my YouTube page. If I get enough of you, I can actually change my URL from the gibberish that it is now to a little bit easier to remember. And as always, my name is Clark Heron, aka the Hairy Hobo, and I'm out.